Hello, students. My name is Mr. Little, and on today's Bite of History, we'll be looking at Chapter 17, Part 3, Mongol Eurasia, Exchange and Transfer. By the end of this History Bite, you'll be able to answer these two essential questions. How did the expansion of the Mongol Khanates influence trade and communication over time? And how did the Mongol Empire impact cultural and technological change and continuity over time? Let's get into it. So, much like the Muslims, with the rise of Dar al-Islam, the Mongols unified many previously disunited cultural zones: the Islamic world, the Chinese world, parts of Europe, parts of northern South Asia. And this led to a great diffusion of technology and goods. Again, if you're seeing parallels here, that's because there are some strong parallels. Integration usually leads to great change. That's a lesson from history. Some scholars have described this time as a Pax Mongolica, or a Mongol peace, because the Mongols united all these previously warring areas, which made trade and cultural exchange possible. But this term should be taken with a grain of salt. A number of historians have also called this into question, because it's well documented that the Mongol Khans fought one another quite a bit after the fragmentation of the empire. So there's some question about if there actually was a Mongol peace, and if there was, how long did it actually last? So, nonetheless, the Silk Road, which is a large collection of small trade routes across Central Asia, linking China and Europe, did see an increase in the volume of traffic because the Mongol Empire unified almost all of the Silk Road. And their policy of promoting trade via lower taxes had a visible result. The policy of protecting the trade routes with a series of postal stations and military garrisons under the Yam system also increased the trade. And Genghis Khan himself also famously hunted down bandits. There's a story about a Taoist monk who goes to see Genghis Khan, but Genghis Khan says, "I'm sorry, I have to go hunt down a bunch of bandits who have been troubling some merchants." And so the traffic on the Silk Road, and by extension the cultural exchange along the axis of Afro-Eurasia, increased greatly under the Mongols. Cultural exchange. This, as I've sort of said before, was a result in part of how the Mongols ran their state. Again, with no experience running an empire, the Mongol states tended to import those from other regions who had experience running empires. So, for example, the Mongols, Kublai Khan in particular, had a number of Persian and Arab scholars and bureaucrats in his court. The Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan also adopted the Uyghur script, and the Uyghurs were another group of Central Asian nomads that are part of what's now Xinjiang in China. But they used this script for administration purposes. The Mongols did not have a written language before, and so they adopted this one so that they could easily run their empire. All of this trade is part of the result of the spread of religions and cultures. Islam had a much larger presence in China, as well as a larger number of Chinese scholars in Persia and the Islamic world. Now, this is also because the Mongols tended to spare those with special skills. The Mongols captured a town. They tended to spare the artisans, the merchants, the doctors, the architects, anybody who could do something of value. And they also tended to kill all the farmers. This leads to an interesting question about how we remember the Mongols, because think about who tends to write history and who tends not to write history. Some food for thought there. Now, several of the Khanates adopted the religions that were the majority in the areas that they conquered, such as the Il Khanate in Persia and the Islamic world, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. The fact that these Khanates adopted Islam allowed the further spread of Islam into Asia, in particular China and parts of Central Asia that had not been reached before. The Mongols in East Asia, in China in particular, adopted what is called Tibetan Buddhism. And although China had its own forms of Buddhism, the Mongols of the Yuan dynasty were in particular taken with Tibetan Buddhism. And during the time that the Mongols ruled China, Tibetan Buddhism actually became very popular and established a presence in contemporary China. And this connection between the Mongols and the Tibetans remained so strong that several later Dalai Lamas after the Yuan dynasty actually came from Mongolia. And to this day, the Dalai Lama has great impact in Mongolia and a great respect in Mongolia. There was also a great deal of ecological change that came out of the Mongol integration. So on the sort of the negative side, the Mongols tended to not really care about settled infrastructure, at least during their conquering phase. Once they settled and were running empires, they tended to try to rebuild infrastructure. But for example, during their conquering phase, when they came into the Middle East and Persia, they pretty recklessly destroyed quite a few wells and water movement infrastructure, which would have devastating effects and permanently reduce the population of the region. Some parts of Central Asia and Northern Eurasia, the Mongols just kind of let their horses run wild and overgraze delicate land, which led to the conversion of some areas becoming steppes or deserts and going from like grasslands to steppe land. And across much of Central Asia, the mass slaughter of farmers and the destruction of water irrigation systems turned a lot of sort of agricultural land into not agricultural land, for lack of a better word. A lot of the Silk Road oasis towns were completely obliterated, such as Merv and Gurganj. And areas that in historic times have been described as vibrant and plentiful crops and water and food, that are today deserts or steppes, in part because of the destruction brought by the Mongols. And you can't talk about the Mongols, unfortunately, without talking about the spread of the Black Death. Now, the Black Death, aka Yersinia pestis, was a bacteria that was believed to be isolated in the Himalayan mountains until the Mongols connected it with Eurasian trade networks. And then via trade and military campaigns, this bacteria got out of its sort of mountain isolated area and just killed millions across Europe, the Middle East, South Asia, and China, and parts of North Africa. And we'll address that more in times to come. But that is definitely one of the ecological changes brought by the Mongols and their spread and their integration in Eurasia. You should be able to answer those two essential questions from the beginning. Thank you so much for joining me on this History Bite, and I'll see you next time.